2. Miro watched Anastasia Fiore, the woman who'd tormented his dreams for the past 6 weeks, play the two dark-haired rogues across from her like a virtuoso. He blinked, his eyes narrowed. Otherwise, he allowed himself no reaction. Despite her swimwear, it had been clear from the moment that he'd watched Miss Fiore enter the beach bar on this island, off the coast of his home country, that she had a mission here that had nothing to do with vacationing and everything to do with these two men. Their harmonic signatures, individual vibrations on an invisible sound scale, jangled his Elioud nerves like the discordant screech of demons. Knowing Miss Fiore as he did, he hadn't been at all surprised that it took a matter of minutes for her to succeed in charming them. She was about the best he'd ever seen, and that was saying something, given that she'd had no idea she had any angel blood until 6 weeks ago, and hadn't had any training in how to use her special gifts. Miro studied Miss Fiore's profile as she stood next to the younger of the two men. In the dimmer setting under the bar's thatched roof, her faint nimbus shone to his penetrating vision. It did not, however, identify her weapons, which were a given for the full-time covert operative and part-time self-appointed protector of the vulnerable. Nor did it give him a better read on the infrared signatures of the two men, which he didn't need to see to know how to telltale sickly cast. What was she after? It could be no coincidence that she'd appeared on Havar at the same time that he was here surveilling an enemy in the age-old battle among angelic forces. What were the odds that the men Miss Fiore had targeted had a connection to Joseph Fagin, chief of the Central Intelligence Agency's Vienna substation, and acolyte to the Dark Irem Asmodeus? Miro lifted his smartphone and snapped a photo of the object of Miss Fiore's charm offensive, the one who resembled a sleazy nightclub owner conditioned by outdated American movies, smuggled into his Eastern European country, and who draped an overly familiar arm around Miss Fiore's petite shoulders as he sat, pinning her to his side. Miro's jaw tightened, but he forced it to relax. Miss Fiore's backup waited outside the club. He focused on the younger man, to apply what he knew about humanity from a long life fighting against its worst impulses. Concentrating, he slowed his breathing and heart rate so that he could harness his Elioud gifts to extract as much underlying angelic data from the man's demeanor and countenance as he could. He might not have the same gifts as Mihail and Andrash, his Elioud comrades, but he'd long honed the ones he did have until he was extremely good at reading people. He often knew where a person with any angel blood stood on the angelic spectrum between light and dark, faithful and unfaithful, and he could usually guess what their particular gifts tended to be. Sleazy nightclub owner had a trace of angel blood, so technically an Elioud, a human-angel hybrid descended from the mating of Irem, or Watcher Angels, and humans in humanity's prehistory, but so garden variety in his levels that he hardly registered on the spectrum as gray. The man, more often than not, used his innate ability to manipulate the people around him for his own selfish benefit. Stasia turned at that moment and set a light hand on the sleazy nightclub owner's bare chest, smiling. The man drew her closer to his side, and his body temperature spiked. His groin radiated like a star. Miro wondered idly if any of the jewelry Miss Fiore wore concealed a dagger. The other man, whose features resembled a coarser version of the younger, with an unfortunate hawk nose pinned onto them, leaned toward her, his gaze sharp and predatory. He had no angel blood. That didn't prevent Miro from identifying him as someone squarely on the side of wrong. He would bear watching. Miro considered the trio. An Italian covert operative, targeting 2 shady Eastern Europeans on an island known for its party life and the attendant hapless tourists, suggested an operation to infiltrate a human trafficking ring. Add in Miss Fiore's propensity for rashly risking her own safety and life to free young women from sex slavery, and he could guess her willingness to serve as bait. He shifted to ease the sudden tightness in his muscles and his upper back, but resisted sending any heat to them. He needed to stay alert and cool, with his Elioud energy feeding his mental faculties, and not to indulge in soothing his human limitations. He continued his impartial assessment of the situation and ignored the theatrics as Miss Fiore punctuated a remark with a hand wave. Now factor in Miss Fiore's Elioud heritage and the fact that her operation took place at the same bar that Fagin, a known agent of a fallen Watcher Angel, had arranged to meet someone. Fagin, who had arrived in Vienna only 2 months ago from a station in the Balkans and could have intelligence on Miss Fiore. Miro answered his own earlier question. The odds that the men Miss Fiore had gotten so cozy with were connected to Fagin were excellent. He sped up his harmonics until he was invisible to the naked human eye and moved closer to Miss Fiore and the strangers. He needed to take extreme care. Though Miss Fiore had no training in using her Elioud senses, she'd shown in the past a striking sensitivity to his presence. But his own Elioud hearing was exceptional. It was worth the risk to overhear what the trio was discussing. Was there more danger here to Miss Fiore than having her real identity exposed or her person harmed? Though Miss Fiore clearly chose to use her Elioud gifts for good in this murky human world, she had also chosen to return to her career as an Italian intelligence officer after learning about her Elioud status. And despite the fact that her close friend Olivia Markham, also newly identified as Elioud and the ex-leader of their trio of rescuers, had left the CIA to marry a Dronguei, an Elioud general. That made the former Miss Markham a Zonia, the Dronguei's lady, and bound to his duty to protect humanity from dark angelic forces. Unfortunately, Miss Fiore's decision to return to her previous life made her a gray Elioud, someone who knew his or her hybrid bloodline and knowingly took no side. It also left Miss Fiore open to angelic persuasion. She could be manipulated into believing that she was acting justly, when in fact she supported the Dark Iram and all their followers in their efforts to sever humanity permanently from the Lord Most High. If she fell into the life of a Dark Elioud, then she also risked the Archangel Michael's wrath. That meant that any contact with Fagin could be used to recruit Miss Fiore to a life she might have cause to regret for eternity. As if on cue, Miss Fiore said, "I am guilty," as she accepted the cocktail that the sleazy nightclub owner cajoled from a waitress who fell for his maneuvering. Those words threw cold water on Miro's speculation about Miss Fiore's immortal soul. He focused on what she was saying, which was that she was an Italian art professor. He frowned. It was an odd ploy for catching the interest of 2 men who seemed most unlikely to be art lovers. But there was no denying the lustful spark that lit the older brother's gaze, or the smug expression that the younger man wore as a result. This was something more than a honeypot to entrap sex traffickers.
"Perhaps you are right,"
the older brother said to the younger.
"And our American friend will appreciate your little Italian beauty and her art knowledge."
Miro's battle senses stirred. American friend? Fagin? Sleazy nightclub owner nodded and sipped from his beer. Looking at Miss Fiore, he asked,
"Signora, what do you know about Rembrandt and Renoir?"
Miss Fiore's heart beat faster at his question. Miro's eyes narrowed. Interesting. And puzzling. She was seducing these men for artwork? In answer, she delivered an expert, casual summary of the 2 famous artists that led the brothers to share a pointed look. Then the younger man grinned in a way that made Miro's jaw ache and said to his brother,
"See, you worry too much. Every man is the smith of his own fortune. She is going to help us negotiate a better deal."
Just then, Miro's cell phone vibrated. He tapped his earwig. "Abdil Dervishi," Olivia Castrioti said, in answer to his earlier text, with the photo of the younger brother appended. "That looks like Stasia with him."
"It is."
Miro snapped a photo of the older brother and sent it to her.
"What is his brother's name?"
"Agron. But don't think to avoid talking about Stasia. I thought you were trailing Fagin. Get a little distracted and lose your way?" Miro ignored the question.
"Fagin has failed to show for a meet at this location. The Dervishi brothers stand out as likely candidates as his disappointed contacts."
"Your spidey sense tingling?" his lady asked. Or did Agron's lack of proper attire clue you in that he doesn't belong at a beach club among scantily clad swimmers? Miro knew that the former American spy still grappled with the reality of being an Elioud, but he had his own adjustment to make for her, including her propensity to make superhero jokes.
You could say that.
The dervishes are Albanian conmen, who like to sell faulty ventilators to hospitals, among other things. Interpol has quite the file on them going back a dozen years, when Loverboy was barely 15. Agron got out of an Austrian prison 4 months ago. Do you think Fagin plans another move against Mihail? Her voice sharpened on this question. Miro knew from experience that she could be as fierce as a dragon when her mate was threatened, and as deadly. 6 weeks ago, Olivia and Mihail Castrioti, the Albanian Dranguet, had attracted Fagin and Asmodeus's notice in Vienna. The American spy master, a narcissistic, power-hungry human, had foolishly gone off on his own after the couple, with a team of Bogomili, humans controlled by Asmodeus. The Bogomili never stood a chance. While it took Mihail and Olivia some time to acknowledge their feelings for one another, they had stood shoulder to shoulder from the start against the brainless thugs. Miro suspected that it was this aspect of the power couple's romance that had found a crack in his formidable leader's emotional armor. The 570-year-old Dranguet had lost his first wife, Luyeta, to a dark Iram near the end of the Middle Ages, and perversely had gone straight into Asmodeus's arms as his greatest acolyte. Mihail had never truly been dark, however. In the early 17th century, the Dranguet had rescued Miro from a horrific life and death, and the Archangel Michael had freed Mihail from his bond with the Dark Iram and given him penance. Suffice it to say, the Elioud general had been reluctant to make himself vulnerable that way again. In the end, Fagin had been taken by Mihail and the other Elioud fighting with him, and charmed into amnesia to forget his failed operation against them. The Dranguet had released the acolyte back into his former life, while keeping him under surveillance. Fagin had so far shown no signs of consciously acting on Asmodeus's behalf.
Unlikely, though not impossible, Miro answered the Zonia. Albanian criminals steer clear of him as a rule.
Miro saw Abdil finish his beer in a single gulp, and then throw some cash on the table. The two brothers stood. Miss Fiore also stood.
Miss Fiore appears to be working an operation involving stolen artwork, if I'm to guess from her cover and the conversation.
Stolen artwork? 2 men who make money off of someone's grandma dying from pneumonia? That seems unlikely.
Unless Rembrandt and Renoir are code names for other players or clever names for the latest party drugs. The dervishes have moved into a new arena.
Artwork at that level suggests non-cash funding for all kinds of illicit activities. Certain arms dealers are known to accept high-value items in trade, for example. Fagin may be working a legitimate CIA operation that the Italians haven't been read in on.
The dervishes are leaving with Miss Fiore.
Fagin must have made Stasia's team outside and moved the location. It wasn't unusual for meetings to be moved at the last minute, especially if one party suspected that the original site was compromised. Had Fagin also guessed that the Italians had someone inside? Whether he had or not, as soon as he saw an Italian woman leaving with his contact, he'd suspect her of being an undercover agent, and Miss Fiore's operation would be blown, not to mention her life at risk.
Not to worry, my lady. I will provide Miss Fiore with backup.
I never doubted that you would. Miro waited as the trio left their table and headed toward the club's exit. Miss Fiore had deftly made sure to keep her tote bag slung over her shoulder when it appeared that Abdil would try to carry it. He suspected that she had her BC-41 in that bag, but he knew she definitely had a 9mm. She'd flashed just enough skin on her inner leg when sliding out of the bench for him to glimpse the black band of her holster. Thank the Archangel she was strapped. As she passed within a meter of his position, Miss Fiore glanced his way. Her gaze caught his, though he was certain that she couldn't see him, sending an unexpectedly wild oscillation through his tightly controlled harmonics. Miro, caught off guard, flailed for a moment until he'd gotten his harmonics back in proper rhythm before turning to follow the group. Behind him, he heard an amazed woman's voice asking her companions if they'd seen the angel in their midst. Fortunately, her friends laughed and asked what she was drinking. He would have to be more careful around Miss Fiore. There was something about her Elioud nature that had a profound and unpleasant effect on his. It could prove deadly for both of them. He followed at a discreet distance. There was another possibility that Miro hadn't mentioned to the Zonia. Fagin might be fully aware of Miss Fiore's presence on Havar. In fact, he might have lured her here. Mihail and Miro had both charmed the CIA officer so that he'd forgotten what had transpired in Budapest when he tried to capture the Castriotes. But that was weeks ago. Anastasia Fiore, a secondary player in the action, might have lodged in Fagin's memory, where his subconscious may have identified her as Elioud, and a valuable prize for his master. Miro had no way of knowing whether Fagin had come on CIA business or not. Although he tapped into the acolyte's personal email and phones, he'd refrained from hacking the CIA servers to gain access to the man's work email and phone. Though he could do so without leaving a trace, he knew that Fagin had treated his relationship with Asmodeus as he would have treated a foreign handler if he were a double agent, meaning off-book. However, Fagin's relationship with Asmodeus was a bit of an enigma at the moment. Normally, the Dark Urim was a formidable opponent who would stop at nothing to gain control of a grey Elioud, of Miss Fiore's obvious talents. In fact, he would prefer having her as his right hand over the lesser human Fagin. But 6 weeks ago, the former Miss Markham had taken them all by surprise when she'd unconsciously used an angelic power move against the fallen angel. The Dark Urim had entered a human vessel to confront her, and she jabbed heated fingertips into the vessel's eyes, sending the temporarily vulnerable Asmodeus into an angelic coma. Their best guess was that Asmodeus had not yet awoken from it. But what if he had? What if Fagin had created a false flag operation so that the dervishes could separate Miss Fiore from her Italian team? The seducer could become the seduced? What if Miss Fiore were the target? Miro tapped his earwig again as he sped up to get through the exit ahead of new arrivals. The dervishes and Miss Fiore walked inland against the tide of people heading into the Hula Hula Beach Club for the evening. Can you identify any chatter around Rembrandt and Renoir? How about the Italians? Is there some way to confirm Miss Fiore's mission with the dervishes? I can try a back channel for some information, but it'll take time. What are you thinking? Olivia was too quick to miss the implication of his questions. That Fagin is playing the Italians for some reason? Miro didn't respond as he maneuvered through the unsuspecting throng fast enough to be in touching distance of Miss Fiore. The 2 Italian agents stationed outside the beach club, pretending to be a couple returning from a stroll to the shore, began following the trio. But the crowd was large enough here that Stasia could be whisked away or mortally injured before they could stop it. Or are you worried about Stasia specifically? His lady asked, as the subject of her question turned north onto Vlad Avelini Street. There were no sidewalks on the narrow street, and only a handful of people walking in either direction. The Italian agents had to drop back or risk calling attention to their tale. Does Miss Fiore make it a habit to accompany dangerous men to unknown destinations without adequate backup? Miro asked, instead of answering Olivia. Besides her 9mm, does she wear any other weapons? She always has options. Is she wearing any jewelry? Some. Then she's got other weapons. If all else fails, she can fight, as I'm sure you're aware. A memory of his first meeting with Miss Fiore flooded Miro. She'd thrown her surujin, a Japanese weighted chain, around his legs. After he'd melted it, she'd thrown herself at him in a fury, striking him over and over before trying to choke him. Not an hour later, she'd launched herself at him again, this time slashing his arm with her BC-41, and not doing more injury simply because he'd managed to move in time. Less than 12 hours later, he'd watched her efficiently and expertly strike and kick a sandbag in Mihail's Vienna gym. They'd ended up fighting side by side against the Bogomili in Budapest. Indeed, was all he said. The dervishes escorted Miss Fiore right onto Red Paul Street and uphill. Ahead, Bishop Yuria Dubokovica Street led east towards the main part of the port town of Hvar. There were also a couple of 4-star hotels in that direction. In his experience, con men like the Dervishi brothers generally sought out the best accommodations and got someone else to pay for them. "We can be there in a couple of hours," Olivia reminded him. "Not necessary." Miro scanned the darkening street. The 2 Italian agents strolled hand in hand, 30 meters behind them. But he sensed no other individuals tracking or watching Miss Fiore and the Dervishis. "You and Mihail are more secure where you are." After their wedding a month ago, the Castriotis had honeymooned on Mihail's estate outside Shkodër in his home country of Albania. As long as they didn't know Asmodeus' status, it was better if the Elioud couple remained there, where the very land boosted Mihail's power. "I could send Andrash." Abdil Dervishi, his hand on Miss Fiore's elbow, turned at a set of stairs next to a market situated at the intersection of the 2 streets. The setting sun outlined Miss Fiore's warm brown hair in golden light for a moment, and the slight air current carried her sweet anise-laced vanilla scent to him. In that instant, Miro was catapulted back in time to his childhood in Split, before he'd learned that the world held some very dark corners, and dark forces toyed with humanity, especially young, pretty children. Shaking his head to clear it, Miro responded to Olivia. "Should the need arise for all-out mayhem and loss of subterfuge, I will let you know." Andrash Naj, the 3rd Elioud in their chorus of demi-angelic fighters, deserved his assigned Hungarian surname meaning large. Over 2 meters tall, he excelled at combat, though not at less direct forms of engagement. Subtlety was lost on the man. "Okay then, I'll see what I can learn about the Italians and any stolen artwork by Rembrandt and Renoir." Abdil's hand dropped from Miss Fiore's elbow before curving around to rest on her hip. Miss Fiore laughed up at him and tried to sidestep his grip, but the creep only pulled her closer. Miro, his harmonics thrumming, slipped next to them. He tapped Abdil's hand, emitting a sharp harmonic burst that would have felt like an intense buzzing along the man's nerves. Abdil yelped and pulled his hand away, stumbling up the last step before falling to the pavement. Agron, who'd been looking through narrowed eyes at the Italian couple behind them, growled and bent to pull his brother to his feet.
"What is the matter with you? Stop playing around. We need to get back to the hotel. I think we're being followed."
Stasia, who'd halted at the top of the stairs, stared wide-eyed at the spot where Miro had passed them, before crossing herself. He hadn't seen that type of reflexive behavior in decades, and only then in elderly faithful women in small Italian and Croatian villages. Compressing his lips together, he held his harmonics steady with an iron will. Wearing a sour frown, Abdil shook his hand as if flinging off something nasty before gesturing for Agron to lead the way. He reached for Miss Fiore, but stopped himself, instead leaning close to say,
"Whatever you did to me, I will find out when we get to our hotel room."
So the Dervishis weren't working for Fagin, or they would have been better informed about the Italian team. Unfortunately, Agron's natural paranoia made the situation more volatile. And now Abdil suspected Miss Fiore of assaulting him. She put a hand on the Albanian's forearm. He flinched, but she succeeded in keeping it there. "I did nothing. It was the angel following us." Her voice rang with impassioned truth. She even looked in Miro's direction. He felt the force of her gaze and wondered if she really could see him. It was an odd, unexpected feeling. Or perhaps she just saw a way to keep Abdil off balance, perchance drive a tiny wedge between him and Agron. Clever woman. Miro could run with her improvisation. Angelic beings loved music, the language of heaven, but it was the Elioud, with their human genetics, who had learned to play jazz. Abdil blinked several times and then, grumbling, pulled his arm from Miss Fiore's hand. "Whatever." He followed Agron, who walked briskly down the sidewalk, his head swiveling as he scanned the sun-washed street. "Come or not, I do not care." Miss Fiore waited until he'd gone 5 meters before she said in a low voice, "Thank you." and then set off after the brothers, her graceful steps unhurried. Behind them at the intersection, the Italian couple turned north and went uphill. Miss Fiore must have signaled them to back off. Miro stayed on her heels, though by now he could see where the dervishes were headed. 5 minutes later, they'd reached the backside of the Amphora Grand Beach Resort, one of the best hotels on the island of Hvar. Guests typically entered the hotel from the private bay, as often as not arriving on their own private yachts. Mihail had stayed here several times during his playboy days, escorting beautiful women by day and battling demons and dark Elioud by night. There were always demons and dark Elioud to battle. With that in mind, Miro's battle senses sharpened as they entered the hotel grounds.